Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back. We will now proceed to panel 2 titled The Partition of Men in Palestine, November 1947. The distinguished panelists for the session are Professor Penny Sinan-Akpol, Assistant Professor of History, Wake Forest University, United States. Professor Laura Robson, Assistant Professor of Modern Middle Eastern History, Portland State University, United States. Chairing this session is Dr. Victor Kattan, Senior Research Fellow, MEI NUS. I will now hand the floor to Dr. Kattan.
Thank you very much. Good morning. Welcome to our second panel on the partition of Mandate Palestine. We have two very exciting papers being presented this morning. I'll introduce each speaker in turn, and then after the second paper, I'll comment on them and then open for questions. So our first speaker is Dr. Penny Sinan-Akpol, who is an assistant professor of history at Wake Forest University. She received her PhD from Harvard University and her BA in history and Middle Eastern and Asian languages and cultures from Columbia University. She's published widely on partition, but she's recently finished a monograph which is titled Partitioning Palestine, British Policy Making at the End of Empire, which I understand is now under contract with the University of Chicago.
The organizers for the invitation and also to the staff for, I can only imagine, handling all of these international visitors and the logistics, so we really appreciate everything that you've done. This would be a very difficult presentation without maps. So, okay. When the United Nations General Assembly voted on November 29, 1947 to recommend the adoption of a partition plan for British Mandate Palestine, it was bringing onto the international stage a concept that had been developing in British imperial circles for about 2 decades. After percolating since the late 1920s through official and unofficial channels in the form of conversations, memoranda, and maps, partition emerged into public view in the form of a proposal put forward by the Royal Commission, in the summer of 1937. Lord William Peel, the Commission's ailing, industrious chairman, a former Secretary of State for India, so maybe a point of convention here, and the grandson of former Prime Minister Sir Robert Peel, led a group of similarly distinguished politicians and academics. In their exhaustive, authoritative report published that July 1937, the Peel Commissioners formally recommended the partition of Palestine into Arab and Jewish states, with select areas to be maintained under British control. But partition, as many of you know, did not fare much better than Lord Peel, who died in September 1937 as the debate raged over the partition plan. Against the backdrop of renewed and intensified Arab uprising in Palestine and a deteriorating political situation in Europe, partition suffered death by 1,000 cuts. Though the British government initially supported the Peel Commission's 1937 partition proposal, strategic concerns and intense opposition from key quarters quite quickly soured the government on partition. The magisterial Peel report, authored in large part by the Oxford Professor Reginald Copeland, was followed in 1938 by the work of a technical commission, if we want to think about boundary drawing, the Woodhead Commission, which had tellingly been nicknamed by residents of Palestine the Repeal Commission. Its members produced a damning and ironically split report on the immense difficulties of drawing a partition line. Finally, on the eve of war, Britain issued the 1939 White Paper declaring partition impracticable, and instead proposing new policies including sharp numerical and temporal limits on Jewish immigration, designed to establish a single independent state of Palestine within the coming decade. In the midst of war, however, as Britain began long-term planning for a Palestine policy, discussion immediately reverted to the prospects of partition, which gained support from within the British War Cabinet. Attempts at resolving the Palestine issue through efforts such as the Anglo-American Commission of 1946 and a series of conferences with Arab and Jewish leaders all failed. And so, by early 1947, Britain began to look for an exit. This was also an incredibly expensive conflict they were managing. What British officials had long referred to as the Palestine problem was officially internationalized with the decision the British cabinet took on February 14th, 1947, to refer the question of future policy for Palestine to the United Nations. The passage of Resolution 181, some 9 months later, signaled the parallel internationalization of partition itself. The aim of the larger essay from which this is drawn is to track the transition from British imperial to international partition planning, analyzing the relationship between the Peel Commission's partition proposal of 1937, the Woodhead Commission's multiple unworkable partition plans, on the one hand, these British partition plans, and on the other hand, the work of the UN Special Committee on Palestine and the resulting partition plan voted on by the UN General Assembly a decade later. So sort of looking to connect the dots between 1937 and 1947. The longer essay from which this presentation is drawn seeks to track both the numerous continuities but also the substantial differences between the two moments, and thus to recover the British imperial roots of the UN's partition plan. Tracing cartographic, demographic, financial, and political ideas and practices as they developed from an interwar British context to a post-war international one, the paper demonstrates the many ways in which key personnel and concepts from the era of the Peel Commission helped to shape the debates for and debates over partition in the post-war period. The essay establishes the contours and provisions in the 1937 and 1947 plans, which I'll do for you as briefly as I can, in order to understand what are underlying structures and assumptions they had in common, and what shifted as partition moved from an imperial to an international tool. I'll try to delineate for you both the parallels and divergences between the 1937 and 1947 plans in an effort to understand what difference the British antecedents made to the process and outcomes of UNSCOP's work. And as with all history, we cannot run a double-blind experiment, right? We don't know how the UNSCOP plan would have looked had the British not engaged in partition planning in the 30s, but I'll try to sort of lay out how those British plans mattered. So, to keep the presentation within the time limit, and to keep the focus on the UN Partition Plan of 1947 within this sort of broader context, I want to take just a few minutes here to point out the key features of the Peel Partition Plan and the contours of the Woodhead maps. So, very quickly and sort of generally speaking, the Peel Plan envisioned an Arab state roughly in the east and the south to be joined with Transjordan. This is sort of an important, so sometimes forgotten piece here, that this was meant to be both a partition and then a merger with Transjordan, which, those of you who know the history, Transjordan had sort of been partitioned off from a larger Palestine at the beginning of the British Mandate. A Jewish state in the north and the west, and then a new permanent British mandatory area covering the holy cities of Jerusalem, Nazareth, and Bethlehem, the area of Lake Tiberias, which is the biblical Sea of Galilee, a sort of odd corridor to Jaffa, a small enclave on the northwest coast of the Gulf of Aqaba. You can already see all the exceptions. And for an indeterminate time, the so-called mixed towns of Haifa, Akko, Sfat, and Tiberias. Perhaps not surprisingly, given its authors, the Peel Plan explicitly aimed at retaining British control over both symbolic and geostrategic assets. These included, Christian holy sites, airfields, the oil pipeline from Iraq, military installations, and of course, access to a deep water port in the Mediterranean. With regards to economies, the Peel Partition Plan, and this you can't see on the map, included treaty-based and financial workarounds for the potential disruption, the almost certain disruption, to the Palestinian economy that partition would represent. While the treaties that the commissioners had sketched out would include basically minorities guarantees, the final section of the plan dealing with partition was the one to tackle the dreaded, as they called it, exchange of land and population, which the commissioners thought should be strongly encouraged, quite possibly, and it looked quite likely, made compulsory. This was a particularly pressing issue as around 225,000 Arabs would be left in the balance of the new Jewish state. And this is, again, something that doesn't often get talked about, I think, as much as it should when we talk about the Peel Plan. The Peel Plan really depended, its coherence depended on forced population transfer. That was quite clear. And we can talk about the models for that, and they do make reference to the Greek and Turkish population exchanges. I won't get into that now for the sake of time, but that's certainly present in their minds. As it happens, the realities of demography, agriculture, finance, and politics in Palestine meant that any detailed study of partition was bound to come to the conclusion that the so-called clean cut would be anything but clean. Anchored by reams of technical data, the report of the Technical Commission, the Woodhead Commission, sent in after Peel comes back with this kind of charming but vague map, and a second commission is then sent in to actually kind of do the dirty work of figuring out how this is going to work. They're strongly encouraged before they leave to come back and say that it's not going to work. But so the Woodhead Commission outlined three partition plans. A so-called majority plan, which is Plan C over here. I don't know how well you can see the salient point is. You will see endless sort of corridors and exceptions. So the majority plan, supported by 2 of the 4 commissioners, so not really a majority. Plan B, in the middle, advocated by 1 member, and Plan A, rejected unanimously by the commission, but still presented in the report. The commission basically used the Peel Plan as a baseline, modifying the lines proposed by that commission, and eventually in the so-called majority plan, Plan C, eventually severely shrinking the proposed Jewish state and radically enlarging, not the Arab state, but the mandated areas, in its effort to devise a workable solution. None of the 3 proposals were at all satisfactory. As I said, even the supposed majority plan only had 2 people supporting it. And so on November 9th, 1938, the government published a white paper along with a Woodhead Commission report, publicly declaring what it had privately decided months earlier, in fact, before the Woodhead Commission had ever gone to Palestine. Namely that, and I'm quoting here, the political, administrative, and financial difficulties involved in the proposal to create independent Arab and Jewish states inside Palestine are so great that the solution of the problem is impractical. So we're sort of back where we started. The Peel report's recommendations were openly dismissed, and the public abandonment of partition was made possible by the final convergence of British political needs and the conclusions born of a detailed analysis of the practical aspects of partition in the Woodhead report. Given the impending war, however, it seems likely that partition would have been jettisoned one way or another, or at least put on hold, right? This was not the moment to start trying to partition, right? After all, the commissioners had arrived, the Woodhead commissioners had arrived in Palestine just after the Anschluss of March 1938, and published their report shortly after the Munich settlement over Czechoslovakia. So this wasn't exactly the moment to sort of pull the rug out from under the Middle East. Despite its apparent demise in 1939 with the White Paper, partition survived the war, and as we know, reemerged most famously in the United Nations Plan of 1947. Partitionist thinking was visible in British approaches to policy in areas ranging from land to municipal governance in the period following the White Paper, as well as in a range of British wartime and post-war proposals made before the UN ever took up the question of Palestine. So partition really does survive and just sort of keeps re-emerging throughout the war. On February 18th, 1947, with the latest roundtable conference between British officials and Arab and Jewish representatives having failed, Foreign Secretary Ernest Bevin addressed the House of Commons. His Majesty's government, he said, have of themselves no power, given our discussions, under the terms of the mandate, to award the country either to the Arabs or to the Jews, or even to partition it between them. It is in these circumstances that we have decided that we are unable to accept this scheme put forward either by the Arabs or by the Jews, or to impose ourselves a solution of our own. We have therefore reached the conclusion that the only course now open to us is to submit the problem to the judgment of the United Nations. And this is a sort of masterful piece of imperial rhetoric, right? We have no power. But as Bevan indicated in his speech, part of turning over the question of the mandate also involved turning over reams of written and statistical material to the United Nations. And so the UN began its study of the problem deeply reliant on British documents, and therefore profoundly shaped by prior British interest in partition. And I think this is fundamental, right? Partition planning under the UN doesn't come out of nowhere. It's built on this sort of foundation of British approaches and British studies. Trygve Lie, the UN Secretary General, directed Arkady Sobolev, the Russian Assistant Secretary General for Security Council Affairs, to form a team composed of 5 members to study the question. And material on the Palestine question was collected and kept in a special library at the UN. 5 volumes of statistics and a wholesome collection of old British proposals and plans were published, and these were used not only by that team of 5, but also by the eventual UN Special Committee on Palestine, and by the Partition Commission entrusted with actually implementing partition after the November 1947 vote. Right? There's sort of a parallel, I guess, to the Woodhead. Ralph Bunche, the American political scientist and diplomat, played a role in all 3 of these groups. An initial member of the small team of 5, he appointed to collect, collate, and produce material on Palestine. Bunche then accompanied UNSCOP to Palestine as a special assistant and ran the secretariat of the Partition Commission. We know that in addition to material officially handed over by the British, Bunche and others received private memoranda, right? There were all these sort of backroom connections. For instance, an analysis of past partition plans written by Sir Douglas Harris, whose 1936 cantonization plans and later partition plans and memoranda really formed the basis of the Peel partition plans. Harris had very close contacts with Reginald Copeland, who wrote a lot of the Peel report. So there are also sort of personnel threads tying the 37 and 47 planning together. Harris had remained active during World War II in developing territorial solutions to the Palestine problem on a range of scales, and had been a critical link between the British partition planning of the 1930s and that of the 1940s. The hallmarks of British partition planning are evident in the UNSCOP plan, and in the slightly modified version of this plan that was eventually voted on by the UN General Assembly. The legacy of the Peel partition plan was apparent in the proposals of UNSCOP made at the end of August 1947, a mere 2 weeks after the disastrous partition of India. Though, as we'll see in a second, the UNSCOP plan was in fact closer in its details to the Woodhead B plan, right? So not the majority plan, not the plan that everybody had rejected, but the plan that one member had supported in Woodhead. At a structural and procedural level, the UNSCOP report, like the Peel report, was the result of an in-depth and in-country investigation. The 11-member special committee spent 2 weeks in Palestine, several days in Lebanon, Syria, and Transjordan, and in a sign of the impact of the European Jewish crisis on the question of Palestine, a week in displaced persons camps in Germany and Austria. As with the Peel Commission, UNSCOP heard evidence in public and private sessions, as well as in informal meetings. And there are really striking parallels, I think, in the ways in which Jewish and Arab leaders approached or didn't approach these 2 bodies. Palestinian Arab leaders had boycotted the Peel Commission until really the last minute, and so their testimony was quite rushed. It came at the end of a long period of time in which the commissioners had sort of absorbed particularly sort of Zionist ideas. And with UNSCOP, they followed a complete boycott. I mean, they never presented public evidence. Meanwhile, as they had done with the Peel Commission, Zionist leaders presented a detailed and finely wrought case in public, and worked incredibly successfully and with great energy on diplomatic and back channels in order to increase the chance that UNSCOP would, as Peel had, come up with a favorable proposal. So after considering unitary, binational, cantonal possibilities, kind of looking at the full range, UNSCOP proposed two plans, one endorsed by the minority and the other by the majority of its members. The minority proposal, supported by the committee members from India, Iran, and Yugoslavia, outlined the creation of a new independent federal state of Palestine, with a bicameral federal legislature and federal courts, in addition to the legislatures and courts of the individual Arab and Jewish states. One federal chamber would be elected proportionally to the Arab and Jewish populations in the entire country, while the other would contain equal numbers of Arab and Jewish representatives. So this is one of these ways of trying to sort of soften the question of representation and sovereignty. The federal government would have control over matters such as defense, foreign policy, federal taxation, transport, and most significantly, of course, for this case, immigration, while the individual state governments would have authority over issues such as education, local taxation, land permits, settlement, policing, public health, agriculture, the sort of things you would expect. In some ways, this minority plan had its roots in cantonal plans developed by British officials in the early to mid-1930s. There are striking parallels, and we know that they had access to those plans. By contrast, the majority plan, supported by Canada, Czechoslovakia, Guatemala, Holland, Peru, Sweden, and Uruguay, and Australia was a member of this commission, but they abstained, strongly echoed the central recommendation of the Peel Report in as much as it advocated partition into two states. It also more fully developed the Peel Plan's economic ideas by proposing a full economic union and mirroring in some ways the mandated areas of the Peel Plan. They proposed creating Jerusalem as a corpus separatum under a special international regime. The differences between the Peel Plan and the UNSCOP Plan were, however, substantial. This is not terribly surprising when we consider that the Peel Commissioners included a number of key figures with extensive imperial experience, and their unstated aim, but nevertheless their aim, was to resolve the conflict in Palestine while simultaneously preserving Britain's moral and material interests in the region. The UNSCOP members, on the other hand, were drawn from a range of countries with different approaches to and interests in the Palestine question, and a number of which explicitly gave their representatives the freedom to develop plans and vote as their consciences dictated rather than as their sort of national interests lay. There's a very different sort of set of interests and parameters at play. One of the most significant divergences between the Peel and UNSCOP majority plans was therefore that the UNSCOP plan did not envision Britain playing a continued role in Palestine as the mandatory or trustee over any part of the territory. Indeed, the first unanimously agreed upon recommendation in the UNSCOP report was that the mandate of Palestine should be terminated, right? And that sort of had to be said. And a further unanimous recommendation was that the United Nations would supervise the body in charge of the transition period. So Britain was basically, Britain had relinquished this control, but that was emphasized in the UNSCOP report. All of the predecessors to the Peel Plan, all of the Woodhead plans, and all of Britain's wartime plans had assumed a formal continued British presence and control over resources as varied as the holy sites of Jerusalem, the oil pipeline that ran to Haifa from the oil fields of Iraq, and the airfields that were crucial for British communications. Not surprisingly, UNSCOP evinced no interest in preserving imperial access to these areas. On a related point, the UNSCOP partition plan did not propose amalgamating the new Arab state and Transjordan, right? And this is important. This was a characteristic it shared along with the removal of the Galilee from the Jewish state with the Woodhead B plan, right? So it actually bears sort of the most resemblance to the middle Woodhead map. And it was one that really differentiated it from the original Peel plan. Again, this change is one we can attribute to the fact that combining the Arab state and Transjordan was an objective of many British policymakers who saw such a unification as a way to retain access to critical geostrategic positions via Britain's ally, the Emir Abdullah of Transjordan, who from 1946 is King Abdullah. Unifying the Arab state and Transjordan would also, from the British perspective, have the advantage of nullifying the political power of the Mufti of Jerusalem, Hajj Amin al-Husseini, who had been instrumental in the Arab uprising of 1936 to 1939, and during World War II had cast his lot with the Nazis. We know from the work of historians such as Avi Schleim that while the UN was busy planning a partition that did not involve a Greater Transjordan, right, this sort of partition and combination, that is precisely what Zionist and Hashemite operatives were seeking with the blessing of the British. So I guess, there's also a point here, which is partition planning happens at one level, and then there's other sorts of planning that happens behind it. Finally, I think we have to note that whereas the Peel Commissioners saw population and land transfer as great necessities such great necessities that they were willing to make them compulsory, even as they emphasized the need for minority protection. The UNSCOP partition plan, on the contrary, privileged choice in matters of citizenship and gave greater detail about the rights to be preserved for all residents of Palestine. The UNSCOP report unanimously recommended that the laws of the new state or states give specific guarantees concerning human rights, fundamental freedoms. They sort of enumerate in quite great detail freedom of worship, conscience, press, assemblage, the full protection of rights and interests of minorities, linguistically, religiously, ethnically, all sorts of, there's quite a detailed enumeration of these rights. With regard to citizenship, the UNSCOP partition plan envisioned that all residents of Palestine would be granted the citizenship of the state in which they found themselves resident in upon independence, or if they were resident in the Corpus Separatum of Jerusalem, would declare which state's citizenship they desired to obtain. Those who wished could opt within, and I'm quoting here, opt within 1 year for the citizenship of the other state, i.e. the one they weren't in, or declare they retain the citizenship of any state for which they are citizens. So this is interesting, right? It's not just that they don't envision forced population transfer, they envision potentially, sort of implicit in here is that possibly there will be Jews in the Arab state who will elect to remain citizens of that state and vice versa, which is, I think, very interesting. Far from being forcibly relocated, that is, the new citizens would have a good deal of latitude to decide their own future states and their own citizenship. Finally, UNSCOP saw fit to specify that, quote, no expropriation of land owned by an Arab in the Jewish state or by a Jew in the Arab state shall be allowed except for public purposes. There were provisions about land remaining unused and uncultivated for a certain period of time, and they stipulated that the Supreme Court of the state in question would have to approve the expropriation. While this provision might be open to interpretation and certainly to manipulation, the point remains that the UNSCOP partition plan explicitly ruled out forced land transfers along with forced population transfers. Remembering that its members had just witnessed the mass violence and bloodshed that accompanied large-scale population movement in the aftermath of the partition of India goes some way, perhaps, towards explaining UNSCOP's aversion to the population transfer envisioned by the Peel Commission, though it raises a more perplexing question about their support for partition as an overall concept. So on balance then, what did the 1937 Peel Partition Plan mean for the UNSCOP planners? And what can we usefully learn about the UN's 1947 partition plan by looking back a decade? For one thing, I think it's clear that the UN plan was not a facsimile of the Peel Plan. As I've just noted, crucial elements, not to mention borders, were substantially changed because the concerns of those drawing up the plans were markedly different. Internationalizing the Palestine problem led to a partition plan that had little to do with British interests, but I think it actually encoded a whole other set of imperial interests. They're just not British ones, right? There's like Soviet ones, they're American ones, but they're not British ones. On the other hand, however, it mattered both pragmatically and intellectually for the UN planners that partition had been considered in such detail by prior British planners. On a practical level, UNSCOP had models to tweak, revise, or abandon, statistics on which to base their work, maps and plans, and even input from those who had been instrumental in the work of proposing partition 10 years earlier. In the realm of ideas, it mattered for UNSCOP that its report was not the first time partition was being proposed. In contrast to the Peel report, which really oddly, it's 400 pages, but it tacks on the partition proposal almost as an afterthought. It's an incredibly short little section. So the Peel report tacked on the partition proposal and could only vaguely sketch out its contours. the UNSCOP report was able to build on the work of the Woodhead and Peel commissions. Those UNSCOP members in favor of partition were likewise able to slowly but surely build consensus around a plan whose basic concepts were familiar to all on the committee. Most crucially, I think, the experience of 1937 had made it clear what the Zionist and Arab responses would be to the UN's partition plan. And so staunch Arab opposition came as absolutely no surprise. It didn't derail the sort of partition proposal in the way that it had in 1938. Handling the debate over partition in 1937 and sort of learning the politics of partition in 1937 meant that Zionist leaders were in a much stronger position in 1947 to lobby UNSCOP members, push successfully for a favorable border, and expertly, and a really sort of a brilliant rhetorical move, frame the Zionist acceptance of partition as a compromise rather than a victory. Finally, it seems hard to ignore the fact that in both 1937 and 1947, partition was in fact, as Victor said, a non-event. We talk and write of the partition of Palestine, but unlike the partition of India or of Ireland, say, this partition never happened. In both decades, the messy reality of implementation, anti-partition politics, and of course war ensured that partition plans remained just that. Thank you.
Thank you, Penny. Our next speaker is Laura Robson, who is an associate professor of modern Middle East history at Portland State University. She's published widely. I mentioned that she has a new book forthcoming called Partitions, A Transnational History of 20th Century Territorial Separatism, published by Stanford University Press in January next year. She's also published books on colonialism and Christianity in Mandate Palestine. You can read more about her bio in the booklet. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that generous introduction, and thanks so much to the organizers, and especially Victor, for putting together this wonderful event. I'm thrilled to be here and to be speaking with all of you. So, I want today to talk about something that didn't happen, that is, the proposal for a single, federated, binational Arab-Jewish Palestine following the British withdrawal, in order to tell us about something that did happen, by which I mean not only the emergence of Israel and the concomitant non-emergence of Palestine as independent nation states, but also some other potentially more globally resonant developments that center around the institution of the United Nations. And in particular, I want to look at this failed proposal for a binational state in Palestine, not just for its consequences regionally, but also as a moment of self-definition for the newly constituted UN. That is a moment when the UN's architects and dealmakers decided to recommit themselves in the most public way possible to a global order in which the nation state would represent the only viable political formation, and in which any new form of international authority would rest primarily on this demonstrated commitment to enforcing the centrality of ethnic nationalism to global concepts of sovereignty. So, in other words, I'd like us to think today about the ways in which the conflict in Palestine between 1947 and 1949 served as a venue, and maybe one of the most important venues, for crystallizing the particulars of the emerging post-war global order. I think it's important to note, first of all, that this was not a new phenomenon. From the beginnings of Palestine as a modern state at the end of the First World War, it had served as a central venue for experiments in new forms of internationalism. In creating Palestine not only as a mandate territory, which happened to other territories in the Middle East and beyond, but also as a designated space for an externally sanctioned and subverted European settler colonial project, the League of Nations was trying hard to ensure its own relevance. Its members already were anticipating that the project of creating and defending a Jewish national home in Palestine had the potential to cement the League's importance as a mediator and facilitator of Middle Eastern territory for the foreseeable future. But this Palestinian role in international governance would become even more apparent in 1947, when the newly constituted UN seized on the idea, with British assistance, of taking over the defunct League's role as political puppet master over Palestine. So the task of deciding what would happen to Palestine following the British withdrawal offered the UN, which was after all a brand new institution, uncertain as of yet about how to define itself or understand its own purpose, the opportunity to cast itself in a central role in the making and maintaining of a regional post-war order across the Middle East, and to publicly declare its capacities for state-making at a global level. So I'm arguing here that the UN's decision for partition in 1947 represented a significant step towards a more interventionist state-building strategy for the quote-unquote Third World, whose ramifications went well beyond Palestine itself. I won't spend a lot of time on the backdrop here, since I imagine most of you are fairly familiar with the developments in Palestine leading up to 1947. But I do want to point out specifically some of the ways in which the, 28-year period of the mandate showcased the creation and the invention of the identifiable political communities of Arab and Jew in Palestine in ways that were important for the kind of future imagining of the idea of partition. As most of you likely know, Palestine began to see Zionist immigration from Europe in the late 19th century, around the same time that the British government started to explore the possibility of incorporating Palestine into the empire, mostly on the grounds of its strategic location vis-a-vis Egypt and India. The First World War offered the relevant imperial opportunity, and the Zionist movement emerged as a potential ally. In November of 1917, a month before the British Army entered the gates of Jerusalem, British Foreign Secretary Arthur Balfour penned a letter with the approval of the British War Cabinet to the London-based Zionist leader Walter Rothschild, committing the British government to the cause of large-scale Jewish immigration into Palestine with a view to creating a, quote, Jewish national home. For our purposes, it's important to note that in July of 1922, the Balfour Declaration's commitment to mass European Jewish settlement in Palestine was ratified by the League of Nations document that incorporated the wording of the declaration into the legal instrument that gave Britain mandatory authority over Palestine. So there are a couple of things to note about this moment. The text of the Palestine Mandate, which is one of these documents that has been kind of endlessly parsed, but not always thoroughly understood, I think, provided a framework of ethno-national sovereignty for the settler population, but not indigenous citizens unless they happen to be Jewish, and it explicitly tied political rights to communal affiliation. So this relates to some of the things that we heard about in the last panel. We are seeing here the beginnings of a remaking of social and economic identifiers, cultural identifiers, as specifically political in nature. That is, from now on, from the beginning of the mandate, the labels of Arab and Jew carried not only cultural and social connotations, but also carried differentiated political rights, differentiated access to the mandatory state. So we can see this, there's in the kind of adaptation of the language of the Balfour Declaration into the League's document, which declared, quote, the mandatory shall be responsible for placing the country under such political, administrative, and economic conditions as will secure the establishment of the Jewish national home and the development of self-governing institutions, that is for Jews, not Arabs, and also for safeguarding the civil and religious rights of all the inhabitants of Palestine, irrespective of race and religion. So in this context, state and empire building were not mutually exclusive projects. And Zionists set to work immediately with British encouragement to develop new proto-state institutions of self-government that were made possible by the new British military occupation of Palestine and supported by the League. In the view of the Palestinian political elite, of course, the Balfour Declaration was fundamentally illegitimate from the beginning, and for the next 3 decades, Palestinian activists would find themselves fighting a rearguard action against these founding documents of the mandate, which legally enshrines the principle that Jewish identity conferred particular political rights not shared by either Muslim or Christian Arabs. As the mandatory state is established, its British architects further formalized and institutionalized this legal and political distinction between the Jewish settler community, which became known as the Yishuv, and the indigenous Arab community. Under Mandate rule, the Yishuv enjoyed a number of collective rights and privileges not extended to Arabs, such as a recognized internal legislative assembly, explicitly nationalist schools and language policies, a flag, and of course, a military wing. This led to a situation by the time we get to the early 1930s of a very divided Palestine that is sometimes referred to as the dual society, in which Arabs and Jews occupied separate political, economic, social, and cultural spheres that had largely been determined by the institutional and legal, particularly legal structures of the British mandatory government. As Penny has already pointed out, in the spring of 1936, this began to come to a head as an Arab general strike brought the country to a standstill and quickly turned into huge anti-Zionist and anti-British demonstrations, leading the colonial government significantly to expand its military presence. To crush the demonstrators, the British began to deploy some of the, quote, counterinsurgency methods they had developed, particularly in pre-partition Ireland. This included recruiting former members of the notoriously brutal Black and Tans to join the Palestine police force. So yet another example of some of the personnel connections among these cases of partition in the late British Empire. Facing this widespread and organized Arab resistance, as we've seen, the British government appointed a royal commission to investigate the causes of what they called the unrest and make a recommendation about future British policy. We've already seen then how in 1937 the Commission published its findings with a nearly 400-page report detailing the increasingly violent and hostile conditions on the ground and proposing for the first time a quote-unquote solution, partitioning Palestine into separate Arab and Jewish states. This particular scheme combined the principles of partition and transfer, in that it was to be made possible not only by the Zionist acquisition of huge amounts of Arab territory, but also by the forcible expulsion of somewhere between 250 and 300,000 Arabs, and simultaneously somewhere around 1,200 Jews, to create a Jewish majority in the proposed Jewish state. And this transfer was justified, particularly at the level of the League, with reference to the Greek-Turkish exchange of 1923, whose architects lauded it as a successful example of nation-state building. So broadly speaking, although the delegates of that year's Zionist Congress were unwilling to accept these territorial specifics, believing that the land provided was insufficient for the Jewish state, they did accept the principle of partition and empowered the Zionist leadership to continue negotiations with the intention of eventually achieving a more favorable deal. But of course, the partition and transfer proposal aroused immediate and implacable opposition among Palestinian Arabs who viewed it as little more than outright theft. And given the maps that we've looked at, it's worth remembering it's worth remembering that in 1947, on the eve of the war, Jewish owners owned approximately 6% of the land in Palestine, so we can see the kind of appropriation of territory that would have been required to enforce even the Peel Commission plan. So as Palestinian anger and the revolt both intensified after the publication of these plans, the British administration began to reconsider its position, and they sent in the second commission of inquiry, the Woodhead Commission, which eventually abandoned the idea. And it was only a decade later, in a very different international and local context, that this almost forgotten scheme was reintroduced. So now we come to the main point. In February of 1947, an increasingly embattled and financially strapped British government, pressed not only by ongoing Arab opposition to the continuation of the mandate, but also by Zionist militias engaging in terrorist activity against British and Arab civilian targets, announced its intention to withdraw from Palestine and turn over the question of its future to the newly formed UN. In May, the United Nations announced the formation of a new commission, the United Nations Special Commission on Palestine, briefly known as UNSCOP, to investigate the situation and make recommendations on the future of the state. It had 11 members, none of whom represented voices on the Security Council. They came from Australia, Canada, Czechoslovakia, Guatemala, India, Iran, the Netherlands, Peru, Sweden, Uruguay, and Yugoslavia. And none of them had significant previous knowledge of Palestine. The Jewish Agency had pressed hard not to include British or Arab representatives on the commission. They successfully lobbied for its members to visit displaced persons camps in Germany and Austria, as Penny mentioned, and won Zionist representation on the political subcommittee. By contrast, the Arab Higher Committee, representing what was left of the Palestinian Arab political establishment, which had been largely demolished during the revolt, saw the resolution as a violation of their right to self-determination and boycotted the proceedings entirely on the grounds that the transition of authority to the UN was illegal and that the question should go to an international court. So Zionist arguments to UNSCOP drew on many of the kind of tropes of transfer and partition that had become well established across the Middle East in the previous 3 decades. A memo from the revisionist group, the right-wing revisionist group Leahy, condensed many of these arguments. They argued that Jewish settlement and nationhood would lead to mass agricultural and industrial development. They argued for the transfer of Arab populations out of the territory, drawing on claims of a long history of effective and successful nation-building exchanges, not only the Greek-Turkish exchange, but also the post-war expulsion of ethnic Germans from Poland and Czechoslovakia, which they described in astoundingly anodyne fashion as, quote, population exchanges between friendly countries. They declared that a pluralistic state was impossible because the majority would eventually, quote, demand a majority in the government and the majority of the population. And it's worth noting that this was not just a right-wing perspective. In his remarks to UNSCOP at that same moment, Ben-Gurion himself echoed many of these well-established points. He declared that the creation of a Jewish state could, quote, realize the maximum development of all the potentialities of Palestine, to cultivate as many millions of dunams as possible out of the 18 million which are at present uncultivated. This is a long-standing Zionist idea that Palestine is a wasteland, essentially a kind of uncultivated land. To irrigate, instead of 40,000, at least 4 million. He also emphasized the impossibility of European Jews living under an Arab government. Quote, a Jewish minority in an Arab state, even with the most ideal paper guarantee, would mean the final extinction of Jewish hope, not in Palestine alone, but for the entire Jewish people, for national equality and independence, with all the disastrous consequences so familiar in Jewish history. The fate of the Jewish minority in Palestine will not differ from the fate of the Jewish minority in any other country, except that here it might be much worse. So UNSCOP spent a few weeks traveling around Palestine. We've already heard about this. The members noted the military apparatus of the British Mandate State. They said, quote, barbed wire defenses, roadblocks, machine gun posts, and constant armored patrols are routine measures. They met with representatives of Irgun, as well as with Haganah and the Zionist political establishment. And they made a brief trip to Beirut, where they met with delegates from a number of neighboring Arab countries to ascertain Arab views on the question of partition in lieu of speaking with actual Palestinians. So, the committee's majority finally produced its conclusion. Quote, the claims to Palestine of the Arabs and Jews, both possessing validity, are irreconcilable. Among all of the solutions advanced, partition will provide the most realistic and practical settlement. This majority report envisioned a 3-way division of Palestine, with an Arab state comprising 43% of the Mandate territory, including the highlands and a third of the coastline, a Jewish state encompassing 56% of the territory, and including the northern coast, the eastern Galilee, and most of the Negev, and a corpus separatum, including Jerusalem and its surrounds, which would be subject to some form of international authority. In describing the plan, of course, the Commission members noted that it suffered from many of the same problems as the Peel Commission's proposal, most centrally, despite the land designations, the continued presence of large numbers of Arabs in the proposed Jewish state. One of the subcommittees even predicted that, quote, at the outset, the Arabs will have a majority in the proposed Jewish state. However, unlike the Peel Commission, UNSCOP did not now feel able to include some form of mandatory transfer. So, UNSCOP's majority partition proposal basically represented a continuation of League concerns and policies and approaches. It accepted the premise that pluralism was inherently problematic and that the United Nations, like its precursor, had a special responsibility to ensure, quote, minority rights, including the protection of the linguistic, religious, and ethnic rights of the people. Further referencing the long-established colonial trope that this was somehow especially true for Palestine, quote, in view of the fact that these two people live physically and spiritually apart, nurture separate aspirations and ideals, and have widely divergent cultural traditions. It also carried on the League's claim that such ethno-national conflicts indicated the UN, as the League's successors, right and indeed responsibility to intervene to protect the principle of nation-statehood. Quote, taking into account the charged atmosphere in which the Palestine solution must be effective, it is considered advisable to emphasize the international obligations with regard to peaceful relations, which an independent Palestine would necessarily assume. So, we need to recognize now, though, that not all of the Commission's members supported partition. 3 of them, representing India, Iran, and Yugoslavia, ironically, proposed a different solution that would have linked the two communities in a so-called federal state. I think it's worth stepping out and noting here that given the general proliferation of scholarship on Palestine and the kind of current political conversation around the so-called one-state solution, the almost total absence of literature discussing this minority proposal is quite striking. There's lots that could be said about this. I'll limit myself in this time that we have left to 2 observations about this failed proposal. The first is that its explicit rejection of the Zionist-derived political premises surrounding ethno-national separatism pointed out the extent to which the UN in general was promoting a specifically ethnic and racialized concept of sovereignty. And second, that it implied a much different and more limited role for the UN as arbiter of sovereignties and delimiter of borders than the one that actually emerged, particularly in the Middle East. So this federal proposal, this minority report, privileged the concept of indigeneity, as they saw it, over the concept of ethnic nationhood and declared real the possibility of a viable pluralistic state. It said, quote, it is recognized that Palestine is the common country of both indigenous Arabs and Jews, that both these people have had a historic association with it, and that both play vital roles in the economic and cultural life of the country. Its authors went on to explicitly reject ethnic nationalism as the highest expression of sovereignty. Quote, 2 basic questions have been taken into account in appraising the feasibility of the federal state solution. That is, A, whether Jewish nationalism and the demand for a separate and sovereign Jewish state must be recognized at all costs, and B, whether the will to cooperate in a federal state could be fostered among Arabs and Jews. They concluded the objectives of a federal state solution would be to give the most feasible recognition to the nationalist aspirations of both Arabs and Jews, to merge them into a single loyalty and patriotism, which would find expression in an independent Palestine. They also declared that the moral and political prestige of the United Nations is deeply involved and denounced partition as an inevitable cause of future violence. Quote, it is important to avoid an acceleration of the separatism which now characterizes the relations of Arabs and Jews in the Near East, and to avoid laying the foundations of a dangerous irredentism there, which would be the inevitable consequences of partition in whatever form. Quite a prescient analysis. So this minority report viewed the settlement as consequential not just for Palestine and for its Arab and Jewish residents, but also for the very nature of state sovereignty in the post-war global order and, not incidentally, for the moral authority of the newly constituted UN. This differed substantially from the majority report, which further committed itself definitively to the cause of separatist and ethnic nationalisms while explicitly refusing to address the origins of these movements. This is really notable in this report, which noted, quote, the basic conflict in Palestine is a clash of two intense nationalisms, regardless of the historic origins of the conflict. That is, without regard to the colonial state that had created this situation in the first place, the rights and wrongs of the promise and counter-promises and the international intervention incident to the mandate. There are now in Palestine some 650,000 Jews and some 1,200,000 Arabs who are dissimilar in their ways of living and separated by political interests. Only by means of partition can these conflicting national aspirations find substantial expression and qualify both peoples to take their place as independent nations in the international community and in the United Nations. So the disavowal of the colonial origins of the struggle in Palestine allowed for a reorientation of nationalisms as primordial and essential and marked by permanent dissimilarity. And second, the placing of this concept of nationalism at the heart of the question of sovereignty and at the heart of any kind of potential membership in the emerging Brotherhood of Nations placed the UN itself in a new light, emphasizing its institutional collaboration with successful ethnic nationalisms and remaking its role as one of arbiter and legitimizer of national claims across the globe. So, the rejection of the federal proposal then had consequences not just for Palestine itself, but for the nature of international governance in general. The decision to partition Palestine was taken not just on the basis of UNSCOP's consideration of local conditions, but in view of a much more general consensus on the part of the leading members of the General Assembly, in particular, of course, the new permanent members of the Security Council, that the UN, in order to justify its existence, would need to play a muscular role in the remaking of the global order. Partition offered the opportunity for the UN to intervene aggressively in Palestine, first by determining where the border would be, as in these maps that we've been looking at, and then by acting as the primary mediator and interlocutor among the various interests trying to renegotiate the issue. And I would argue as a separate question that we could nevertheless discuss, by serving as the guardian of the hundreds of thousands of refugees created by the partition decision, a status that of course still holds 70 years later. Even more centrally, Palestine offered the opportunity for the UN to affirm to an anxious superpower constituency that it would uphold the absolute centrality and the sole legitimacy of the nation-state as the fundamental locus of power in the post-war era. The partition resolution offered the opportunity to showcase the UN enforcing an ethno-national level of sovereignty from its position of international authority. So, in my last 30 seconds here, I want to suggest that this view of the partition of Palestine actually explains in part why there was so much interest across the Middle East in subsequent years in non-national models of sovereignty. The Arab League and the broader cause of Arab nationalism, culminating in the short-lived UAR in the 1950s, took as a fundamental assumption that nation-statehood was a tool of imperial oppression, and that alternative modes of claiming independence might serve the region better. And such ideas were, of course, not limited to the Middle East, but enjoyed a great deal of currency across the decolonizing world, where varying concepts of federalism had a moment in anti-colonial movements from the Caribbean to Africa. For many Arab leaders in the post-1948 world, the UN's support for the forcible partition of Palestine, which of course in the end did not lead Palestinians even to the geographically truncated independent Arab state originally envisioned, but rather to permanent dispossession and statelessness, served to underline the ways in which post-colonial nation-statehood could serve an emerging neo-imperial world order. But it might also help to explain why Arab and especially Palestinian attachment to the nation-state only intensified in the aftermath of 1948 and again after 1967. By endorsing partition and rejecting a federal division of sovereignty for Palestine, the UN had clearly demonstrated that ethnic nationalism represented the only kind of claim to political sovereignty that would have a chance at being heard in the international arena. It is no surprise then that so many Palestinian leaders would come to see their best chance of regaining some of what they had lost as lying in the most intransigent kind of nationalism. The real lesson of 1947 for the decolonizing world in general and the Palestinians in particular was that a committed ethno-nationalism was now the only game in town.